The Auction Block, A Legacy of Chains. Chapter 1. Echoes from the Auction Block. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the creaking of old wood and the distant chirping of birds that had no idea they perched near a place of deep human sorrow. The auction block stood in the middle of the town square, cracked, weathered, and forgotten by some, but not by all. For those who remembered, or had been taught to remember, it was more than an artifact. It was a wound carved into the earth itself. 85-year-old Clara Jenkins walked slowly toward it, her cane tapping against the cobblestones. Her great-great-grandmother had once stood on that very block, priced like property, sold like a burden. Clara touched the wood with her fingertips, as if feeling for the echoes time could not erase. She closed her eyes and listened. Not with her ears, but with her soul, and in the quiet. She could almost hear the cries, the prayers, the desperate whispers of mothers clutching babies and men biting their tongues to keep from breaking. Around her, the town had moved on. Tourists passed by with cameras, capturing the scene without understanding it. Locals avoided eye contact, as if acknowledging the block's existence meant acknowledging what it represented. Clara exhaled slowly. She wasn't here to shame anyone. She was here to honor the memory, to be a living witness, to say, "I remember. And I will make sure others remember too." The past doesn't die, she thought. It echoes loudest in the silence. And sometimes all it takes is one voice, standing on the same wood that once held chains, to remind the world that history never truly leaves us. It lives in the soil, in the air, in the names carved into headstones, and the stories passed from trembling lips to listening hearts. Chapter 2. A Price on Humanity. The dusty records sat in the courthouse archives, untouched by time but stained by truth. Yellowed pages with inked names and cold numbers listed human lives as inventory. Beside each name was a price. $400, $700, $1,200, depending on age, gender, and health. No mention of dreams, no column for sorrow, just names and numbers, as if souls could be bought and sold like sacks of grain. Jamari Evans, a young history professor, had returned to his hometown in Mississippi to uncover these stories. He pulled a thick volume from the shelf and opened it with reverence, aware that these pages once represented someone's mother, brother, child. The figures listed weren't just economic transactions, they were remnants of lives interrupted. He ran his finger down a page and paused at the name Eliza, age 17, $950. He whispered her name aloud, as if calling it into the present. That day, Jamari stood before his students at the local community college with a new kind of lesson. He brought photocopies of the ledgers, laying them gently on each desk. "You see this?" he said. "This is what happens when we reduce people to property. This is not just history, it's trauma that breathes through generations." He told them about Eliza, about a boy named Samuel who was sold at 8, about a man named Moses who was valued less because he limped. The students listened, wide-eyed and heavy-hearted. Some cried. Some asked why they had never learned this before. Jamari's voice trembled with emotion. When you put a price on humanity, you strip it of dignity. But when you tell the stories behind those numbers, you give that humanity back. In that moment, the students weren't just learning history, They were reclaiming it, and Jamari knew that maybe, just maybe, the value of a life could never again be calculated in dollars and cents. Chapter 3. Chains of the Mind. Even after the physical shackles were broken, the chains remained, wrapped around thoughts, stitched into language, and buried deep within the psyche. Isaiah Brooks knew this all too well. Born decades after the civil rights movement, Isaiah had never known the sting of the whip or the threat of the auction block. But he had grown up in a world that still echoed with the language of oppression. As a child, Isaiah was told to be careful not to speak too loud, not to dress too boldly, not to dream too big. "Don't draw attention to yourself," his father had said. "They'll think you're trying to be something you're not." At first, he believed it was about safety. But over time, Isaiah realized it was also about fear. Fear passed down like an inheritance, forged in a time when silence was survival. Now a poet and social worker in Georgia, Isaiah used his words to unravel those mental chains. He ran workshops for young black boys, teaching them not just to write, but to think freely. One afternoon, a quiet student named Malik asked, "Why do we have to be strong all the time?" The room fell silent. Isaiah looked at him and said, "Because we were taught that strength is the only way to survive. But I'm here to teach you that vulnerability is strength too." He shared a poem he had written. "They chained my wrists, but not my words. They tried to bind my mind, but still I dreamed." The boys listened wide-eyed. Some smiled, some cried. Later that night, Isaiah sat alone in his apartment, staring at a photo of his grandfather, a man who had picked cotton, endured insults, and rarely spoke of his past. Isaiah whispered, "I'm freeing you, Granddad, one thought at a time. Because the hardest chains to break are the ones no one can see." And Isaiah had made it his life's work to break every last one. Chapter 4. Heritage of Silence. Silence had become the family's most sacred tradition, not out of choice, but necessity. For generations, the Carter family passed down their story, not in words, but in glances, in gestures, in long pauses during dinner conversations where truth hovered but was never spoken aloud. The legacy of their ancestors, who had once been sold, displaced, and erased, was stitched into the quiet moments. Ruth Carter, 42, had grown up in that silence. Her mother, Della, never spoke about their lineage beyond a few cryptic comments. "We come from strength," or "Our people endured." There were no photographs older than the 1950s, no handwritten letters, no diaries. It was as if the family's history began halfway through the 20th century, abruptly cut off like a sentence never finished. It wasn't until Ruth's daughter, Maya, asked her to help with a school genealogy project that the silence began to break. Maya's classmates traced their roots to Ireland, Italy, or England with photos and maps. Maya brought home a single census record from 1870 with a name, Sarah Carter. Listed only as a domestic servant. Who was she? Maya asked. Ruth didn't know, but the question lingered. It haunted her until she drove to the state archives and spent hours poring through old documents. Slowly, painfully, pieces of Sarah's life emerged. Born in 1845, enslaved until 1865, a mother to 3, never learned to read but signed her name with an X. Ruth returned home with copies of records, eyes swollen from crying. She gathered her family and laid out the documents on the dining room table. "This is where we begin," she said. "This is who we come from." In that moment, the silence was broken, not with a roar, but a whisper of truth, enough to begin a new legacy, one built on voice, memory, and the courage to speak where others had been forced to stay silent. Chapter 5. Bonds Unbroken. The rusted iron gate groaned as it opened, revealing the old family church that had stood for over a century on the outskirts of Charleston. Paint peeled from the wooden siding and moss crept up the stones, but the spirit inside was strong. Every Sunday, the pews still filled with descendants of those who had once been enslaved, their voices rising in hymns passed down not just through time, but through blood. Eleanor Fields stepped into the church, holding the hand of her grandson, Elijah. He was only 8, but his eyes were already wide with questions. Eleanor had brought him here for more than a visit. She brought him here for understanding. "This," she whispered as they walked down the aisle, "is where we survived." The old wooden pews had cradled generations of her family. Her grandfather had helped build them with scraps left over from the plantation stables. The pulpit was handmade by her great-uncle, a man who had once been forbidden from learning to read, yet taught himself scripture in secret by moonlight. The stained glass windows had been donated by a freedwoman who cleaned houses for decades, saving every penny. Elijah sat beside Eleanor as the choir began to sing. He didn't know the words, but he felt the power in the harmony. It was the kind of song that didn't need translation. It spoke to the soul. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Why do we still come here?" he asked. "Because this is where we remember who we are," she said, "and who we've always been." The service ended with a prayer for the ancestors and a moment of silence. As they left, Elijah turned back and looked at the small, weathered building. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. In his silence was a promise that the bonds forged in struggle and love, though tested by time and tragedy, would remain unbroken. Chapter 6. Scars Invisible. Tiana Wallace sat in the doctor's office, her hands trembling slightly as she filled out the family history form for her prenatal appointment. As she reached the question about known genetic conditions, she paused. What could she write when history had stolen so many answers? She knew her mother had high blood pressure and her grandmother had died young, but everything before that was blank, like pages torn from a book before it was ever read. It wasn't just about genes, it was about stories, about the trauma no one talked about, but everyone carried. Tiana had grown up seeing it, in the way her mother jumped at loud noises, in her uncle's refusal to talk about his childhood, in her aunt's tendency to hoard food like it might run out any moment. As a therapist now, Tiana understood the concept of intergenerational trauma, but understanding it didn't make it easier to live with. She often told her clients, "Scars don't always show. That doesn't mean they don't ache." After her appointment, she drove to her grandmother's old house, now abandoned and surrounded by weeds. She stood on the porch, remembering the stories her grandmother had shared in whispers when she thought no one was listening. Stories of the good white folks who still made her enter through the back door. of her own grandmother who had been whipped for learning to read, of the day they were told their last name had changed again, just like that. Tiana knelt down and touched the soil by the front steps. "I don't know all your stories," she whispered, "but I carry them. I carry you. Invisible scars don't make us weak," she thought. "They make us real." And as she stood up, hand on her stomach, she knew she would raise her child to know that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant honoring the wounds and daring to grow stronger in their shadow. Chapter 7. Burden of the Past. Devon King stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie for the 5th time. It was the day of his big presentation at the state capitol, a chance to propose legislation that would provide funding for African American history programs in public schools. Yet the weight in his chest had nothing to do with public speaking nerves. It was the weight of stories he carried, stories he had never told. He had always been the one to succeed, the first in his family to graduate college, the first to own a home, the first to be called sir instead of boy at his job. But beneath his polished surface, Devon held tightly to a past that felt too painful to release. His grandmother had raised him with a mix of love and fear, teaching him to be twice as good and half as loud. He remembered the day he found an old journal in the attic, wrapped in cloth and nearly crumbling with age. Inside were scribbled memories from his great-grandfather Elijah, who had worked on a tobacco plantation after emancipation but was never paid in cash, only credit he could use at the company's store. It was legal slavery, just dressed in new language. That journal changed something in Devon. It forced him to stop pretending that his success meant freedom. It showed him that even now the past had claws. It clung to every generation until someone named it, owned it, and challenged it. Standing at the podium hours later, Devon's voice didn't tremble, it burned. "We are not asking for pity," he said. "We are asking for truth. For our children to know that their roots run deeper than chains, deeper than suffering. They run deep in courage, in resistance, in legacy." The applause came, slow at first, but then it rose like the sound of shackles breaking one by one. Devon had carried the burden of the past to the present, and now he placed it in the hands of change. Chapter 8. Whispers in the Cotton Field. The cotton fields stretched endlessly beneath the blazing Mississippi sun. The same fields that had swallowed generations of voices into the hush of swaying white tufts. Fields where children had once picked until their fingers bled, where songs of sorrow and hope were carried on the wind. Though the harvest was long mechanized now, the memories still clung to the soil, like ghosts refusing to leave. Amara Lewis, a documentary filmmaker, stood in the center of one such field, camera in hand and heart pounding. She was filming a segment for her project, Rooted, a series on ancestral land and memory. Her great-grandmother had worked these exact rows, and Amara had grown up hearing about the fields in fragments. A name, a smell, a song hummed under her breath when no one was listening. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the furrows, Amara knelt and ran her fingers through the dirt. It was warm, soft, and yet unbearably heavy. Heavy with all the labor it had consumed. Heavy with the silence it had imposed. She turned on the camera and began to speak. This soil remembers. Even if the world forgets, even if textbooks erase, even if monuments fall, the land remembers. She played a recording of her great-grandmother's voice, a rare audio clip preserved from an old cassette tape. In it, the old woman sang a spiritual in a trembling, unwavering tone. As the sound drifted through the field, Amara imagined the past rising all around her, whispering stories that had gone untold. She stayed until dusk, filming the field, the shadows, the echoing song, and when she left, she carried more than footage. She carried whispers, promises, the weight of remembrance, because sometimes you don't have to shout to honor your ancestors. Sometimes all it takes is listening to the land where they once stood and hearing the whispers in the cotton field. Chapter 9. Memory's Heavy Yoke. The museum was quiet that morning, its marble floors echoing softly with each step as visitors trickled in. In a back gallery, dimly lit and curated with reverence, stood a glass display holding a single object, a faded cotton sack with hand-stitched words that read, "My name is Rose. I carried this for my baby." Zora Martin, a college senior studying cultural anthropology, stood before the display in stunned silence. She had read about items like these, objects passed down from enslaved mothers to their children as tokens of love in times of unspeakable separation, but she had never stood face to face with one. This one belonged to a woman whose child had been sold away from her, and the sack held pecans, a lock of hair, and a scrap of fabric. Everything Rose could give when the world gave her nothing. Zora felt the weight of memory settle on her shoulders like an invisible yoke. She had always thought history was something to be studied, catalogued, written about, but standing there, it felt different. It felt alive. It felt personal. She took out her notebook and scribbled furiously. History is not past. It's breath, it's bone. It's the sack you carry when love is all you have left. Later that afternoon, she interviewed the museum curator, an older man named Mr. Benton who had spent decades collecting such artifacts. "You know," he said, placing a careful hand on the glass, "memory doesn't just preserve, it demands. It demands we remember the cost, not just in pain, but in love, in resilience, in sacrifice." That night, Zora dreamed of Rose, not as a figure in history, but as a mother. A woman with trembling hands and a breaking heart, sewing threads of hope into the seams of a cloth sack. Zora vowed to carry that memory forward, not out of guilt, but out of honor. Because when the past feels too heavy to bear, it's often because it's asking not to be forgotten. Chapter 10. Breaking the Cycle. Marcus Hill had spent most of his life outrunning shadows, not the kind that followed you in the sun, but the ones that crept inside, a lineage of pain passed from generation to generation like an unwanted heirloom. He had watched his father drink away his regrets, and his mother bury her voice under layers of worry and weariness. Now, in his early 30s and a father himself, Marcus stood at a crossroads. His son Dorian was 5 and full of questions. Why do people stare at us? Why do I have to be quiet when other kids don't? Why does Grandpa never smile? Questions Marcus once asked and never received real answers to. He knew he had to give Dorian something different. Not just love, but freedom. From shame, from silence, from inherited fear. One Sunday afternoon, Marcus took Dorian to the neighborhood park. They played tag, laughed, and shared a sandwich on a worn bench. As Dorian chased butterflies, Marcus pulled out a notebook. It wasn't for work. It was for healing. He began to write a letter to his son, to his father, to himself. You deserve a life where your worth isn't questioned, where your name isn't whispered in fear, where your joy isn't seen as rebellion, where your love doesn't have to be hidden. You deserve freedom, not just in body, but in soul. When they got home, Marcus tucked the letter inside a book of bedtime stories. That night, as Dorian drifted to sleep, Marcus sat by his side and whispered, "It ends with me." He didn't have all the answers. He didn't have a perfect plan, but he had a promise. And that promise was powerful enough to break what history had tried to make permanent. In every laugh, every hug, every bedtime story, Marcus was undoing generations of silence. And for the first time, he felt something stronger than pain. Hope. Chapter 11. A Legacy Revealed. Autumn leaves danced through the cemetery gates. As Ava Richardson stepped carefully between weathered headstones, a folded family tree in her hand and questions stirring in her heart. She was 32, a history teacher by trade, but a seeker by nature, and today she was tracing names etched in stone to a legacy buried far deeper than the earth beneath her feet. She had grown up hearing fragments of her ancestry, names without faces, stories without endings. But last month, a DNA test revealed connections to a small community in Virginia. Ava followed the trail, interviewing elderly relatives and exploring dusty church records until she arrived at this place, a graveyard hidden behind an abandoned chapel. There, she found it. A headstone carved with her great-great-grandfather's name, Silas Richardson. Born 1852, died 1917. Underneath was a phrase that stopped her cold. He walked free, but never forgot the chains. Ava knelt before the stone, heart swelling. Silas had been born into slavery and lived to see its end. He had married, farmed, and built a school for black children in his county. One of the oldest living residents recalled hearing Silas speak of freedom not as a moment, but a calling. "It ain't about being unchained," he once said. "It's about what you do with your hands once they are." That evening, Ava stood before her class, holding up a photo of the gravestone. "This is where my story began," she said, "and where yours might too. History isn't just something we learn. It's something we carry. The legacy Silas left wasn't just in her blood. It was in her bones. In every lesson she taught, every student she empowered to ask, to dig, to feel. And in finding him, Ava had found herself. Some legacies are revealed not in gold or glory, but in footprints that refuse to fade. Chapter 12. Truths Long Hidden. Julian Banks was the kind of man who rarely spoke unless he had something to say. At 54, he had lived through protests, policy changes, and promises never kept. He owned a small bookstore in Savannah, filled with weathered volumes on history, philosophy, and black liberation. But behind the counter, In a locked drawer beneath the register, he kept something far older than any book, a faded, leather-bound journal passed down from his great-aunt. He had never shared it with anyone, not even his daughter Celeste, who was now studying political science at Howard University. The journal was his inheritance, but also his burden. A handwritten account of horrors survived, secrets kept, and strength forged in silence. On the anniversary of his great-aunt's death, Julian sat in the back room of the shop, the journal in his lap. The pages were brittle, filled with loopy cursive and tear stains. One entry detailed how she had watched her younger brother be dragged away in the night for asking too many questions. Another described her job as a housegirl and how she would sneak food to the field workers under her apron. And near the end of the journal was a passage that made Julian tremble. "They think we forget, but we remember in silence, and when the time is right, the silence must end." Julian looked up, his eyes misty. He stood and unlocked the drawer, then walked to the front of the shop, where Celeste was flipping through a biography of Angela Davis. "I think it's time you read this," he said, handing her the journal. Celeste's eyes widened. "What is it?" "Our truth," Julian replied. "The kind they never taught us in school." As she began to read, Julian felt something shift. The truth was no longer hidden, it was alive. In her hands, in her mind, in her future. And finally, the silence that had protected it for so long began to speak. Chapter 13. Shackles of the Heart. Naomi Ellis had always been the strong one. At least, that's what everyone said. The friend who kept everyone together. The daughter who didn't cry at her mother's funeral. The teacher who pushed through exhaustion to keep her students inspired. But behind that strength lived a quiet ache, one that pulsed in her chest like a second heartbeat. It wasn't physical chains that bound Naomi, it was emotional ones, forged over years of being told to toughen up, to not let her guard down, to never be too sensitive. She had learned early that vulnerability was dangerous, that tears were a luxury, and that to be respected meant being unreadable. But it was costing her friendships, peace, and sleep. One evening, while cleaning out her late grandmother's attic, Naomi stumbled upon a box marked "Letters Never Sent." Inside were dozens of folded pages, each one written by her grandmother to family members, friends, and even herself. Love letters, apologies, regrets, hopes. Her grandmother, whom Naomi had only known as reserved and stern, had carried a world inside her, one she never shared aloud. As Naomi read through them, a line from one letter struck her deeply. "I've built walls so tall to protect myself, I forgot they also kept love out." That night, Naomi sat at her desk and wrote a letter of her own, not to anyone else, but to herself. "I forgive you for the walls, for the silence, for believing you had to be unbreakable. You are allowed to feel. You are allowed to be held." It was the first time she cried in years, not out of sadness, but relief. The shackles around her heart didn't snap with noise, they loosened with grace. Naomi realized strength wasn't about carrying it all. It was about knowing when to let something go. And sometimes the greatest revolution begins in the quietest release. Chapter 14. Paths to Freedom. The road stretched out in front of Elijah, winding through the hills like an uncharted journey. His footsteps echoed against the empty pavement as he walked with purpose, though he had no clear destination. The world around him seemed to be in a constant state of flux, a reminder that time didn't wait for anyone. And yet, for the first time in his life, Elijah felt like he was finally able to breathe. For years, Elijah had been running, not from physical threats, but from expectations. The suffocating weight of being the successful son, the model student, the perfect employee had worn him down. At 29, Elijah had become the person everyone else wanted him to be. He had achieved everything: degrees, jobs, promotions, recognition, but still felt like a stranger in his own life. He had followed a path set out for him by others, believing that success was measured by the milestones others celebrated. But even when he checked off all the boxes, the emptiness remained, gnawing at him in ways that he couldn't explain. The expectations were insidious, subtle in their constant pull, shaping his choices until his life no longer felt like his own. He had been taught that freedom was a luxury, that to make it, he had to sacrifice his desires, his own voice, for the greater good. But as Elijah walked along the road that night, something stirred deep within him, a feeling he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was a yearning, a desire to find his true self, to carve out a space that wasn't defined by anyone else's vision. As he walked, he thought about the conversations he'd had over the years, about the career paths he'd followed out of obligation, about the relationships he'd kept in order to fit in, about the moments he had silenced himself just to avoid rocking the boat. They had all been choices made out of fear. Fear of disappointing others, fear of failure, fear of the unknown. But now, as he walked down this seemingly endless road, Elijah realized something profound. Freedom wasn't a destination. It wasn't a place he could reach by following someone else's rules. It was a journey in itself. And it began with the courage to step away from the prescribed path. The sun dipped low, casting long, soft shadows over the horizon. Elijah stopped and looked up at the sky, feeling the cool evening air brush against his face. There, in the quiet of the world around him, he felt something shift. The weight he had been carrying seemed lighter, as if the burdens of expectation had been momentarily lifted. He could finally see the road for what it was, a chance to redefine his life, to choose his own direction. In the distance, he could make out the town he had grown up in, the place that had always felt both familiar and confining. The streets held memories of his childhood, of the people who had shaped him, but they also represented everything he had been running from. The town was a symbol of everything that felt small, confined, and limiting. Elijah knew that returning would mean stepping back into the life he had spent years trying to escape, but for the first time, it didn't seem as suffocating. As his phone buzzed in his pocket, Elijah's heart sank. It was a text from his mother asking if he was coming home for the weekend. A simple message, but one that carried with it all the unspoken pressure of years of unfulfilled expectations. He stared at the screen, a lump forming in his throat. It would be so easy to fall back into the old pattern, to go home, to say the things that would make everyone happy, but that wasn't the path he was meant to follow anymore. For the first time in years, Elijah didn't reply. He didn't need to. He wasn't ready to go back. Not yet. The thought of returning to the familiar, of slipping back into his old life, seemed like the last thing he needed. Instead, he turned off the phone and slipped it into his pocket, the weight of the decision grounding him further in his new resolve. Elijah stood still for a moment, allowing the cool breeze to wash over him, and then, for the first time in years, he took a deep breath. The road ahead was uncertain, it was unmarked, but it was his, and in that moment, it felt like a path toward freedom, not just from the past, but from the expectations that had haunted him. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments of doubt, times when he would question his decisions and wonder if he had made the right choice. But for now, Elijah felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He was no longer running from anything. He was simply walking, one step at a time, toward a future that was his to create. And with that, Elijah took the first step. It was small, but it was enough to begin his journey toward freedom. A journey that would take him to places he had never imagined. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to face whatever came next, on his terms. And that, Elijah knew, was the true meaning of freedom. Chapter 15. Liberation from Within. For years, Gabriel Davis had lived in the shadows of his own life, waiting for a moment when he would finally be free. But as he stood at the edge of the stage, the bright lights casting sharp contrasts and shadows across his face, he realized that the freedom he had been searching for wasn't something that could be handed to him. It wasn't something that others could give. It had to come from within. At 35, Gabriel had spent most of his life trying to prove himself, trying to live down the mistakes of his youth and live up to expectations that, in hindsight, were never truly his own. He had built his life around the idea that if he could just be successful enough, if he could just perform well enough, the weight of his past would fade away, the lingering feelings of inadequacy, regret, and unresolved pain would be covered by applause, admiration, and accolades. But now, standing before thousands of people on the stage of America's Got Talent, Gabriel realized something profound. The only way to liberate himself wasn't by pretending, by performing even better, but by embracing the real truth of who he was. It wasn't about running from the past, it was about accepting it. For years, Gabriel had been afraid to show the world the real him. He was terrified of being exposed, of showing his vulnerability. He had kept his pain hidden, his doubts and fears buried beneath layers of false confidence under the facade of perfection that he had so carefully crafted. But tonight was different. Tonight, in front of a national audience, Gabriel was ready to be vulnerable. He wasn't going to hide behind a mask any longer. He was going to let go of the image he had so desperately tried to maintain. Tonight, he was going to show the world who he truly was. The music began to play, and Gabriel felt his heart race. The opening chords seemed to vibrate in his chest, a reminder of all the struggles he had faced, the battles he had fought in silence, the pain he had kept hidden for so long. His mind flashed back to those moments in his past, the times he felt hopeless, lost, and alone. But now, as the music swelled, he felt something shift. The notes in the music, the rhythm of the beat, they weren't just sound, they were pieces of his story coming to life. Gabriel had been through so much in his life. Loss, heartache, loneliness. For years he had carried these burdens with him, afraid to speak about them, afraid to admit how deeply they had scarred him. But standing on that stage, with the lights shining on him and the world watching, he realized something. All of it, every painful experience, every moment of despair had shaped him into the person he was today. And that person, the real Gabriel, was enough. He wasn't perfect, but he was human, and that was something worth celebrating. As Gabriel began to sing, the words flowed from him, raw, real, and honest. He sang about the pain he had carried for so long, the scars that had marked him, and the journey he had taken to find his way back to himself. With each note, he felt lighter. With each phrase, he felt the weight of his past lifting from his shoulders, piece by piece. The audience, the judges, they were just a blur in his mind. All that mattered was the moment. This moment where he finally allowed himself to be free. By the time he finished, the room was silent. The echoes of his voice still lingered in the air. The judges looked at him, eyes wide with emotion, some even with tears. They had witnessed something extraordinary. Gabriel had exposed his soul, but in that vulnerability, he had found his true strength. He didn't need to hide anymore. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be himself. The silence was broken by a standing ovation. But Gabriel wasn't focused on the applause. It didn't matter to him. What mattered was that he had liberated himself. It wasn't the approval of the judges, the fame or the recognition that had freed him. It was the act of sharing his truth, of showing up fully, without shame. As the applause continued, Gabriel stood there, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. It was as though he had finally reconciled with his past, with his pain, with his flaws. And for the first time in his life, Gabriel felt like he could breathe. The weight that had once chained him was gone. He was no longer hiding. He was free. Gabriel's journey had been long, filled with hardships and moments of doubt, but tonight he had broken free. Not because of the applause, not because of the judge's approval, but because he had accepted himself, flaws and all. That was the true meaning of liberation, and it was something no one could take away from him